For decades, millions of Americans have built their entire retirement plans around a simple assumption that the rules governing their pensions, taxes, and savings wouldn't suddenly change after they had already spent years, sometimes decades, planning their future. But a quiet decision from the Supreme Court has just shaken that assumption in a way almost no one expected. In a unanimous ruling, every single justice on the court agreed on something that could reshape retirement protections across the entire country. The decision didn't just settle a legal debate. It fundamentally changed how states are allowed to treat the financial promises people rely on when planning their retirement. And the surprising part is that most Americans haven't even heard about it yet. There were no massive headlines dominating every news channel. No dramatic political battles playing out for weeks on end. Yet, the implications of this ruling could reach into pensions, retirement taxes, and long-term savings plans for millions of people. Think about this for a moment. Imagine you've spent 20 or 30 years carefully structuring your retirement. You calculated when you could retire. You chose where you would live. Maybe you even moved to a different state because of its retirement tax laws. All of those decisions were based on the rules that existed at the time. But what happens if a state government suddenly decides to change those rules after the fact? Could they rewrite the deal after you've already built your life around it? That question has been hanging over retirement planning for years. And until now, the answer wasn't always clear. States have often argued they have broad authority to change policies whenever budgets get tight. Retirees and workers, on the other hand, have argued that changing those rules after decades of planning feels like the rug being pulled out from under them. Now, in a rare and powerful moment of complete agreement, the Supreme Court has stepped in and delivered a definitive answer. And what the court decided could create a nationwide legal shield around retirement expectations that millions of Americans depend on. But the real story isn't just that the court ruled. It's why they ruled the way they did, how this decision changes the balance of power between individuals and state governments, and who stands to benefit the most from these new protections. Because once you understand what the justices actually said, you start to realize this ruling could quietly reshape the rules of retirement planning in ways that are only beginning to unfold. Hi, I'm Olivia, and today we're going to break down this Supreme Court decision step by step so you can clearly understand what changed, why it matters, and what it could mean for your financial future. A lot of legal rulings get reported in a way that makes them sound complicated or distant from everyday life, but this one is different. The core idea behind the decision is actually surprisingly simple. And once you see how it works, it becomes clear why legal experts are already calling it one of the most significant retirement-related rulings in years. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through exactly what the court decided, how it affects retirement laws across all 50 states, and why millions of workers and retirees could now have stronger protections than they did before. We'll also look at who benefits the most from this ruling, including public employees, retirees who move to different states for tax reasons, and people currently building their savings through retirement accounts. And later on, I'll show you a few practical steps experts recommend taking right now, so you can protect your own retirement planning in light of this new legal landscape. Because while the ruling itself is powerful, understanding how it works and how states might respond to it could make a real difference in how secure your retirement plans are moving forward. So to understand why this decision is such a big deal, we first need to start with what actually happened at the Supreme Court and why the fact that the ruling was unanimous makes it far more powerful than most people realize. To understand why this ruling carries so much weight, you first have to look at something that almost never happens at the Supreme Court anymore. Every single justice agreed. This wasn't a narrow 5-4 split where half the court strongly disagreed with the other half. It was a full 9-0 decision. Justices appointed by presidents from completely different political parties all came to the same conclusion. In the legal world, that kind of unanimity sends a powerful signal. It tells lower courts, lawmakers, and government agencies that the principle behind the decision isn't controversial inside the court. It's settled law. And when the Supreme Court speaks with that kind of unified voice, it often creates a precedent that shapes how policies are written for decades. The reason this particular ruling matters so much is because it centers around a concept the court described as fundamental reliance interests. At first glance, that phrase sounds like dense legal language you'd expect to hear in a courtroom argument. But the meaning behind it is actually straightforward. The court recognized that when people make major long-term decisions based on laws that governments have already established, those decisions create legitimate expectations that deserve protection. Think about the types of choices people make when planning retirement. Someone might decide how much to save each year based on how retirement income is taxed in their state. Another person might accept a public sector job with a specific pension formula in mind, knowing that the benefits promised after decades of service will form the backbone of their retirement income. Others might even relocate across the country, selling homes and moving closer to family or to states with more favorable retirement tax policies. None of those decisions happen overnight. They are built slowly over years, sometimes over entire careers, and every one of them relies on the assumption that the rules guiding those decisions will remain reasonably stable. What the Supreme Court essentially said in this ruling is that those expectations are not just personal hopes or financial guesses. They can carry constitutional significance. When a state creates laws that people reasonably rely on while planning their financial futures, the government cannot simply reverse course later in a way that causes significant harm to those who relied on those rules. In other words, the court signaled that long-term financial planning based on existing law deserves meaningful protection. This is where the decision creates one of the biggest shifts in legal power that retirement policy has seen in years. Before this ruling, states often had wide latitude to adjust retirement-related policies whenever budget pressures emerged. Legislatures could change how pension formulas worked, modify retirement benefit calculations, or alter the way retirement income was taxed. And while individuals sometimes challenged those changes in court, they usually faced a steep uphill battle. The burden of proof was typically on the retiree or worker to demonstrate that the government had acted improperly. That meant hiring attorneys, navigating complex legal systems, and often trying to prove that the change violated constitutional protections, a difficult and expensive process. For many people, the practical reality was that once a state decided to modify the rules, there was very little an individual could realistically do about it. The new ruling flips that dynamic in a very important way. Instead of forcing individuals to prove that a government change is unfair, the court's framework places much more responsibility on the state itself. When a policy change threatens to disrupt long-standing reliance interests, the government must now justify that decision under a much stricter constitutional standard. In simple terms, the presumption starts to lean toward protecting the people who relied on the original rules. If a state wants to alter retirement laws in ways that affect people who plan their financial future around them, the state now has to explain why that change is necessary and why it outweighs the harm caused to those individuals. That shift may sound subtle at first, but legally it represents a dramatic rebalancing of power. Instead of retirees and workers constantly defending themselves against policy changes, governments may now find themselves defending those changes in court. And that single reversal who carries the burden of proof is one of the main reasons legal analysts believe this decision could ripple across retirement systems, tax policies, and pension programs nationwide. Once you understand how the legal balance has shifted, the next obvious question is who actually benefits the most from this new protection? Because while the ruling technically applies nationwide, its real impact will be felt most strongly by certain groups of people whose retirement planning depends heavily on long-term government policies. Experts generally point to 4 groups that stand to gain the most immediate protection under this new legal framework. The first group is state and local government employees. We're talking about teachers, firefighters, police officers, public health workers, city employees, and countless others who spend their careers working in public service. Many of these workers accept lower salaries during their careers with the understanding that a defined pension will support them in retirement. Those pensions are typically built on formulas that calculate benefits based on years of service and salary history. In the past, when states faced serious budget pressures, some lawmakers tried to adjust those formulas by reducing cost of living adjustments, increasing retirement ages, or modifying how benefits were calculated. What this ruling signals is that if someone spent years working under a specific pension structure and contributing to it with the expectation that those rules would remain consistent, the state may now face significant constitutional barriers before changing those terms in ways that harm existing workers or retirees. The second group that could benefit significantly includes retirees who move to another state based on retirement tax policies. Every year, thousands of Americans relocate after they retire. Sometimes it's to be closer to family. Sometimes it's for weather or lifestyle reasons. But very often, it's also because certain states advertise favorable tax treatment for retirement income. Some states, for example, do not tax pension income at all. Others provide exemptions for certain retirement benefits or Social Security income. When people make a decision as major as selling their home and moving across state lines, those tax policies frequently play a big role in the calculation. Under the reasoning outlined in this ruling, if someone moves specifically because a state promised certain retirement tax advantages and the state later tried to eliminate those advantages in a way that significantly harmed those retirees, the individuals could now argue that their reliance on the earlier law deserves constitutional protection. The third group includes millions of workers currently saving through retirement accounts like 401ks, for 403bs, and other employer-sponsored plans. While these accounts are primarily governed by federal law, state policies still affect how retirement income is treated, particularly when it comes to taxation or distribution rules. If a state were to implement policies that dramatically changed how that retirement income is treated after people had spent decades contributing under a specific set of expectations, this new legal framework could become relevant. And the fourth group, which often flies under the radar in discussions about retirement policy, includes Social Security recipients in states that tax those benefits. Only a handful of states currently tax Social Security income, but for retirees living there, even small policy adjustments can significantly affect monthly budgets. If a state were to introduce new taxes or expand existing ones in ways that materially affect retirees who structured their finances around previous laws, the reasoning behind this ruling could become a powerful tool for challenging those changes. To see how this protection might work in the real world, it helps to walk through a simple example. Imagine someone who spent 30 years working, saving carefully, and planning for retirement. Over time, they research different states and discover that certain places offer significant tax advantages for retirees. Perhaps a state advertises that pension income is not taxed or that retirement benefits receive special exemptions. After carefully reviewing those policies, the person decides to move there after retiring. They sell their house, relocate, establish residency, and build a retirement budget based on the understanding that their pension or retirement income will not be taxed by the state. That decision isn't just a casual choice. It's a major life move involving housing, healthcare providers, community ties, and long-term financial planning. Now, imagine that several years later, the state legislature faces a budget shortfall and decides to introduce a new tax on retirement income. Under older legal interpretations, retirees might have had limited ability to challenge that change. The state could argue that tax policy is always subject to revision and that lawmakers must retain flexibility to manage state finances. But under the framework described in the Supreme Court's ruling, the situation may look very different. Those retirees could argue that they made a major financial and lifestyle decision in direct reliance on the state's earlier law. Their relocation, housing choices, and long-term budgeting were built around that promise. If the state suddenly changes the rules in a way that significantly harms them financially, courts may now examine whether that change violates those reliance interests the Supreme Court described. In other words, the government may need to demonstrate that its decision is justified despite the harm it causes to people who plan their lives around the previous rules. That possibility alone is why this ruling is already attracting so much attention among retirement policy experts, pension analysts, and legal scholars, because it suggests that retirement planning decisions, once considered largely personal financial calculations, may now carry a level of constitutional protection that didn't clearly exist before. Of course, the Supreme Court didn't just introduce a broad principle and leave it at that. The justices also outlined how courts should evaluate future cases where retirement laws are changed after people have already relied on them. In other words, they created a framework judges can use to decide whether a state has crossed the line. Legal analysts often describe this framework as a kind of reliance impact analysis. And while the name may sound technical, the structure of the test is actually quite straightforward. It essentially asks three critical questions that must be examined whenever a government policy change threatens people who plan their financial future around earlier rules. The first question is whether individuals actually relied on the existing law when making long-term decisions. In most retirement situations, that answer is fairly obvious. Workers decide how much to contribute to their retirement accounts, when they can afford to retire, and where they will live based heavily on the legal and financial conditions in place at the time. Someone who spends 20 or 30 years paying into a pension system under a specific formula is clearly relying on that structure when planning their future income. A retiree who relocates to a different state because it offers favorable tax treatment for pensions is also relying on those policies. If that reliance can be demonstrated, it establishes the first major piece of the legal argument. The second question focuses on harm. Courts will examine whether the government's new policy causes material financial damage to the people who relied on the previous law. Minor administrative adjustments might not meet that threshold. But if a new policy reduces pension benefits, imposes unexpected taxes on retirement income, or alters financial rules in ways that significantly reduce someone's expected retirement income, the harm becomes much easier to demonstrate. And when both reliance and material harm are present, the legal burden begins to shift in a meaningful way. That's where the third and most important question comes in. The state must show that it has a compelling reason strong enough to justify making the change despite the damage caused to those individuals. This is where many potential policy changes could face serious scrutiny. Governments frequently adjust financial policies to deal with budget shortfalls or political priorities. But under the reasoning of this ruling, simply saying that a state needs more revenue may not automatically justify rewriting rules that people depended on for decades. Courts could require a much stronger explanation before allowing those kinds of changes to stand. And that combination of factors is what creates the new dynamic many legal observers are focusing on. Instead of retirees and workers always being forced to prove the government acted improperly, the legal structure now asks the government to explain why it is justified in overriding the reliance people placed on earlier laws. It's a subtle but powerful shift that changes the starting point of the legal conversation. Understanding the legal framework is important, but the real question for most people is what they should actually do with this information. Because while a Supreme Court ruling can reshape the legal landscape, it only becomes truly useful if individuals know how to protect themselves within that new framework. Think of this moment less as a piece of news and more as a tool. Something that can help strengthen the financial planning you've already been building for years. Experts who study retirement law often suggest 3 practical steps that people can take to make sure their planning is supported by clear evidence of reliance. The first step is documentation. This may sound simple, but it's incredibly powerful. If reliance interests become important in future legal disputes, the ability to show exactly what rules existed when you made your financial decisions could matter a great deal. That means keeping records of the policies that shaped your retirement planning. For example, you can visit your state's Department of Revenue website and locate the pages explaining how retirement income, pensions, or Social Security benefits are taxed. Saving a copy of those pages, whether as a screenshot, a printed document, or a PDF file, creates a record of the law as it existed when you reviewed it. The same idea applies to pension enrollment materials, retirement account documentation, benefit statements, or official notices explaining retirement rules. Every one of those documents can serve as evidence showing the expectations that guided your financial decisions. The second step is consultation. Retirement law intersects with financial planning, tax policy, and estate planning, which means the details can become complicated quickly. Speaking with a qualified financial planner, retirement specialist, or legal professional can help translate this Supreme Court decision into practical guidance for your specific situation. Professionals who work in this field can evaluate whether any part of your retirement strategy depends heavily on state policies that could potentially change in the future. They can also help you identify what records to keep and how to structure your planning so that your reliance on existing laws is clearly documented. The third step is review. For public employees in particular, this step can be especially important. Reviewing pension documents, benefit formulas, and plan descriptions can help clarify exactly what promises were made when someone entered the system. If those terms were ever changed in a way that significantly reduces expected benefits, the documentation showing what existed before the change could become extremely relevant. None of these actions require complicated legal knowledge. They simply create a clear record of the expectations you relied on when making long-term financial decisions. And in a legal environment where reliance interests may now carry constitutional weight, that kind of documentation could prove far more valuable than many people realize. Let's take a closer look at that first step, documentation, because it may turn out to be one of the most important things individuals can do in this new legal environment. The reason is simple. Reliance is much easier to prove when there is a clear record showing exactly what information people used when making their decisions. Think about the kinds of details that typically shape retirement planning. State tax rules on pension income, whether Social Security benefits are taxed, the formulas used to calculate public employee pensions, exemptions for retirement accounts. These policies are often published on government websites or explained in official documents provided to workers and retirees. Many people read this information when they are planning their retirement, but they rarely think to save a copy. Under the framework described in this Supreme Court decision, keeping those records could become extremely valuable if a state later changes a rule in a way that affects your retirement income. Having documentation showing what the law said at the time you made your decision helps demonstrate that you relied on that information in good faith. One of the easiest places to start is your state's Department of Revenue website. Nearly every state publishes detailed explanations about how different types of retirement income are taxed. These pages often outline whether pensions are taxed, whether there are exemptions for certain types of retirement benefits, and how Social Security income is treated. Simply saving a PDF of those pages or printing them for your records creates a time-stamped reference point. If the policy changes later, you have a record showing exactly what guidance was available when you were making your plans. The same approach applies to retirement plan documents. If you participate in a pension system, keep copies of the enrollment materials that explain the benefit formula and retirement eligibility rules. If you are saving through a 401k, 403b, or a similar account, keeping periodic statements and plan summaries can help show the structure you relied on when determining how much to save and when you expected to retire. Even official letters from pension administrators or retirement plan providers can serve as useful documentation. Each one helps establish the expectations that guided your long-term financial planning. Another important part of documentation is simply keeping a clear record of major decisions you made based on those rules. For example, if you move to a different state because of its retirement tax policies, keeping records of that decision, such as real estate transactions, relocation documents, or financial planning notes, may help demonstrate that the move was influenced by those policies. When courts evaluate reliance interests, they often look at the broader context of a person's decisions. Showing that a law played a meaningful role in shaping those decisions can strengthen the argument that changing the rule later would cause real harm. Again, none of this requires complicated legal strategy. It's simply about creating a clear paper trail that shows the environment you relied on when building your retirement plan. But while this ruling creates important protections, it's also important to understand that it doesn't end the conversation. In many ways, it may actually mark the beginning of a new phase in how states design retirement-related policies. State governments rely heavily on their ability to adjust financial policies to manage budgets, respond to economic changes, and address long-term pension obligations. When a Supreme Court decision introduces stronger protections for reliance interests, lawmakers and policy advisors naturally begin looking for ways to work within those boundaries. That means we will likely see states experimenting with new strategies that attempt to adjust retirement policies without violating the principles the court described. Some of those strategies are already familiar in policy discussions. One approach is the use of grandfather clauses. Under this model, existing workers and retirees continue operating under the original rules, while new employees hired after a certain date fall under a different system. By separating the two groups, lawmakers attempt to change future obligations without disrupting the expectations of people who already relied on the earlier structure. Another strategy involves gradual phase-ins. Instead of implementing a sudden change that immediately affects retirement income, a state might introduce adjustments slowly over many years. Lawmakers sometimes hope that spreading changes over a longer timeline will reduce the financial harm experienced by individuals and make the policy more likely to survive legal scrutiny. In other cases, states may simply pass aggressive reforms and allow the courts to determine where the constitutional boundary lies. That approach effectively turns the issue into a legal test case where judges evaluate whether the change respects or violates reliance interests. Because this ruling is relatively new, the exact limits of these protections will likely be defined through future cases as different policies are challenged in court. That means the legal landscape surrounding retirement planning could continue evolving for years as judges interpret how far these protections extend. For individuals planning their retirement, that uncertainty makes one thing increasingly clear. Staying informed about changes in state policy is no longer just a matter of curiosity. It has become an important part of protecting the financial plans people have spent decades building. All of this leads to an important realization that many people are only beginning to appreciate. Retirement planning is no longer just about saving money, choosing investments, and deciding when to stop working. It's also about staying aware of the laws and policies that shape how that retirement income will actually be treated. For decades, many Americans assumed that once they understood the rules, they could safely build their plans around them and move forward with confidence. But as pension systems, tax policies, and state budgets have evolved, it has become clear that those rules can sometimes change. What this Supreme Court ruling does is acknowledge that reality while also placing meaningful limits on how far those changes can go when people have already structured their lives around the original system. In effect, the court is recognizing that retirement planning isn't just a private financial exercise. It's a long-term partnership between individuals and the legal framework created by government policies. When people follow those rules for decades, saving money, contributing to pension systems, or relocating based on tax policies, the expectations created by those rules deserve to be taken seriously. That's why awareness is becoming such an important part of retirement security. Knowing what your state legislature is considering, paying attention to proposed tax changes, and understanding how pension systems are evolving can make a significant difference over time.